This episode of the DevEd podcast is produced by Thinkster.io. With the rapid pace of change to front-end and back-end frameworks alike, staying up to date with your skills can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. With our expert-led courses on Thinkster.io, you have instant access to hundreds of courses on topics ranging from Angular, React, and Vue to Python, Rails, Docker, and a whole lot more. You can even customize your learning path to include any combination of front-end and back-end technologies that are relevant to you. Thinkster.io, a better way to learn.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the DevEd podcast. My name is Joe Eames. I'll be your host for today. And on our panel today, we have Jesse Sanders.
Hey, everybody.
Luis Hernandez.
Hola.
Preston Lamb.
Hello, everyone.
And Mike Dane.
Hey, what's up?
I'm excited for today's episode. We're a little bit different from some of our previous episodes because we're going to talk about something hardcore code related, which is comments. This was discussed earlier, so I'm going to frame the conversation and why we decided to do an episode on comments. I do a several times a week newsletter out to the Thinkster.io newsletter subscribers, and usually I try to do one that's about code quality, one that's about something technical, JavaScript, TypeScript, web type related, and then one that's about like being a good person, emotional health related. So of the code quality ones, one that I sent a couple of weeks ago was, I've been sending in a series on code smells. Right, and just to review for anybody who isn't familiar with what a code smell is, a code smell is some kind of a pattern that you might look for in your code that indicates that there may be a problem. Like when you smell a bad smell in your house, you worry that maybe there's something going wrong. Maybe you got some food going bad. Maybe your cat died in the vent. Hopefully not that. But there's something you should investigate and see if there's a problem, right? That's the idea of a code smell. It doesn't necessarily mean there really is something wrong. It just means that it's worth taking a second look at what is going on and deciding, is it something that can be improved, or maybe it's fine the way that it is? So in this particular newsletter, I've done like 4 or 5 of them. In this last one, I wrote about code smells, comments as a code smell. And so I'll kind of give a brief overview of what I sort of said and then what happened after that. So in the blog post, I basically talk about how when we make comments in our code, we are essentially admitting some kind of a failure, right? And that is either it's a failure of expressiveness, and it might be a failure of our own inability to produce our code in such a way that it's very readable to other programmers, or it might be a failure of expressiveness of the technology, right? The technology itself doesn't lend, whatever language we're using and third-party tools and stuff don't lend itself to creating readable code, even if we have to deal with performance or those sorts of things. And then there's other bad parts about comments. One, they could become out of date, and a comment that is out of date and is like becomes truly wrong could be have a really negative effect on maintenance costs. And then also comments can get separated spatially from code over time as we add in more lines of code in between the comment and the code that it applies to, or just the fact that code can grow means that we can also get this misplaced comment that is now not next to the code that it comments, and then it loses its value. So after I sort of pointed out all these things. And more than any other blog, I got a lot of replies of people saying, I totally disagree with what you're saying. Comments are good, blah, 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 right? So we sort of had chatted about this at the beginning of an episode a couple of weeks ago and decided, hey, we should do a whole episode because we had a lot of really interesting opinions that came out. So with that framing in mind, again, I'm taking the position that comments in general are bad, and that you can universally look at a comment and say that this comment is a failure of expressiveness. And so let's just sort of like open up the conversation with one, people's opinions on comments. Do we use a lot of comments? Do you use little comments? Go around the panel and talk about how often people are using comments and what they feel about the comments, and then maybe like an agree or disagree, and we can move on from there.
I can start. I pretty much almost never use comments. Yeah, I think I tend to agree with what you're saying, Joe, where, generally if you do need to have comments, I feel like a lot of times a comment could just be replaced by naming variables better, structuring things better, or just organizing the code in a way that's more readable. So if you have to put a comment in, like if I'm putting a comment in, it's generally because I'm doing some very weird thing, or the framework or the library that I'm using isn't named correctly or something like that. And it's just some weird thing that needs to happen, and then I just need to notate it. However, I will say, I think for beginners, comments can be pretty good. Like when I first started learning how to program in school, they would have us comment like every line of code. And I think as a beginner, it just helps you to break down exactly what the code's doing. And by writing it out in plain English, it helps you to make that transition between, being a non-coder to actually like learning how to read code fluently. So I think for beginners, comments are great, but for an experienced dev, I agree. It's almost always a code smell.
I think historically, I started out putting a lot of comments in my code, and it just started to become messy and creating a lot of bloat in there. And it was actually a lot of things that were captain obvious. Now set X to this, now do this, now do that. And I think maybe it stemmed from a technique that I'm not sure if it's still taught, but writing pseudocode first, using comments, and then starting to fill that in. But anymore, when I see comments, it's usually on something that's like 600 line function that's really nasty. And it's really a code smell for, hey, this really deserves a refactor. Outside of that, kind of tag along with what Mike said there, is that there's certain scenarios where something is really not obvious. There's some sort of hack, there's some sort of issue. I might put a to-do in there and say, we need to come back and refactor this. Outside of that, I really don't think comments are all that useful.
Yeah, so I was sitting here thinking, and I'm pretty sure that at some point in one of my early classes at Utah State, they told us to use comments all the time. And so for a while, I was a little bit more in the habit of writing comments. But I kind of did find, I think Jesse kind of said this, that a lot of times my comments were pointless. Like, here I'm assigning a variable, and you could tell that right below. And so I think comments like that, they don't add any value. And then Joe mentioned this at the beginning, when you leave comments in your code like that, and then you do have to do a refactor, a lot of times people, they may not know which comments to delete or whatever, or they add a line and they forget to move the comment, and then the comments don't line up anyways. And so I try to keep my comments to a minimum as well. And a lot of times, like Jesse said, they usually end up being to-dos. Like, I know I need to refactor this part, but I was in a hurry, so I didn't. And so that's why this is here, but I'll come back and do it later.
Got nothing new to say. It's the same thing. Like, I'm kind of bullish about that too. Like, I think the only reason you should have comments is when you need to explain the why or something that is not obvious. Why am I doing it this way? And then you explain the why. But anything else should be expressed in code. Your code should have enough information by itself to tell you exactly what's going on.
That was something that you said when we first had this discussion that I really felt like struck me, and I wish that I had put that in my original email, was you said comments are more acceptable when they express why, but when comments express how, right, that in and of itself is usually almost always a bad thing. And that really struck me and stuck out to me as a really great way, especially, Luis, you spent a lot of time teaching new people. Who was it that said that they used a lot of comments at first? I think that was you, Mike, right? Like, yeah. I think that also is very common that as we learn to develop, the use of comments is a great way to sort of slow down the development process, right? Jesse talked about the practice of writing pseudocode first in comments, and then slowly, once you've written down and documented what the algorithm is going to be, then you turn that into actual code, right? And as you turn it into code, you can, at that point, decide whether or not to keep comments or delete them. A lot of people keep them because, especially when you're first starting out, the comment can explain some code that either because you're newer, you yourself have a harder time reading, or other people might have a harder time reading, or maybe you realize that this isn't particularly expressive. I don't look at this code and see the intent and structure of the code. An analogy I like to use a lot with people as they learn, especially first starting out learning to code and then get farther along, is that if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, there's that scene where they're sitting in the ship and he's got all the screens up and it's like in the middle of the night and he's talking with the main character, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, and the one guy who turns out, I won't spoil anything if you haven't seen it. They're talking, right? And he says, he's like, they're just looking at this screen where all these characters are like just falling down the screen. And he says, after a while, you stop seeing the characters. Now I just see blondes, brunettes, redheads, right? Like he's talking that what these symbols now to him, he's actually just seeing the real people going on in this virtual reality world, right? And I think that's a really good analogy is you start getting years of experience in coding, you start seeing the code for what it does, and it almost supersedes the characters that are involved. Like, I would guess that if we polled the audience here, or polled our panel, here, that if I said, hey, if I put up a block of code can you glance at that code and not necessarily read a given line, but just glance at that code and make a snap judgment as to whether or not the code is well factored, relative level experience of somebody who crafted that code? Might you pick out some potential problems in that code in just 1 second of glancing at a full screen of code? And my guess is a lot of you would say, yeah, I could show you examples of code and you'd pick out stuff just by looking at the shape of the code, So that idea that code becomes more and more readable over time. So when we're earlier on, comments can serve a lot of purpose because the English explains something that over time, the code itself starts to speak to you as you get more and more experience with coding. So I think those are good points. But let's go back through again and let's talk about when we personally use comments, like the types of things that we like to actually use comments on. So let's hit the other side of the coin and when we actually like to use comments.
Again, for me, is the why. Let's say that an example that I normally tell students, because as you said, I keep bumping into this nearly every day. If you have something that is using a callback function, but you know that the rest of the code is using promises, but you have this one piece of code that is breaking away from all of the rest of the code base. Why is this using callback instead of a function? It turns out that maybe you depend on a library because you need to support an older browser and that library hasn't been updated. And you depend on that library, and that library hasn't been promisified yet, right? So you have to use a callback. The only way that you could use it is through a callback. Anybody that comes into that code that knows that we are using promises, but why is this code? The first instinct that you're going to have as a developer on the team, I hope, is to go and leave that code better than what it was. It's this is something that we missed. Let me go and fix this and make it a promise. So the obvious thing and the right thing to do would be to align that with the rest of the code base, but this would break it. So in those cases, I want to have that comment in there. Say, hey, please don't refactor this into a promise because and you explain why we're using this library. When that dependency goes away, we can come back here and refactor it. But every time you have something that is non-obvious, that moves away from everything else that we do in the code base, remember that consistency is key. So whenever you break that consistency or something is not immediately obvious, that's when I need to explain that why. Not the how, but the why. In those cases, I see the value in comments.
I got 2 words for you, Joe. Job security. If I take my 1,000-line function and then I add comments to it that actually confuse you and make it sound more complicated than what it is, you'll never be able to maintain that code yourself, and I'm going to have to be employed forever. That is my. Oh, by the way, Joe, you cannot really go for a spoiler alert thing on a movie that's 25 years old. Seriously, if they haven't seen it by now, I'm sure they're probably not going to see it. So,
as long as I don't accidentally give away who Luke's father is.
Yes, exactly. Whoa. We'll go there. Star Wars is different. No, in all seriousness, Luis is dead on with it. Is the why, if we can't change something and there's a reason why it can't change, those things should be in there. But otherwise, I do see people that write really complex stuff, and I don't know if that's really for job security or whatnot, but it's really unnecessary. And so I don't really see a lot of examples where outside of the documenting the why that would make sense to say, hey, this really belongs there.
So I have a question for everyone then, as Luis and Jesse were talking, because I agree with them. So my question is, if you work on a team with a lot of younger developers who are newer, is putting in some comments, even though it's maybe not real necessary, do you think that's a good idea to help out some of the younger developers on the team and say, hey, this is why we do this, or this is how you do this part, or this is how you use that function? Can that be a benefit to younger developers?
I think that's a really good point. But I think that is that in lieu of training younger developers on the why? Yeah, and is that because we're lazy as a team and we're not sharing that knowledge explicitly? So, and by the way, while you were talking, I was actually thinking of one example where I would use comments, by the way, and that is writing tests. I'll often put in the 3 steps for writing tests. The setup,
arrange, act, assert.
Yeah, exactly. Arrange, act, and assert. And I'm guilty of that pleasure there of doing that one. But outside of that, I think with going back to the other question there on the younger developers, I feel like that could be a way for us to then avoid the topic of making sure that they understand the concepts. And if they don't understand the concepts, then we really should be pairing with them and working with them and getting them to understand the why and not just documenting it to avoid that conversation.
I like a lot of what you just said, Jesse, although I want to point out a couple of things. So the first one is the question of when do we use comments? So my answer to that is more than I should, but I also feel like I wasn't clear in my first email, but I had a follow-up email to it where I said code smells are an ideal, right? And really, any sort of coding craftsmanship process is an ideal. And sometimes part of the problem is it's very subjective, right? It's not always clear what is better code versus less effective code. What one person thinks is better, another person might think is less. I've certainly had people come to me who were relatively senior programmers who would say, oh, I just like the 500-line method because everything's together. I don't have to look all over for stuff, which I disagree, but I get that at least that's their opinion. But there is an ideal. An ideal is something you work towards, but potentially never achieve, right? We're never going to be perfect in our coding. So for me, I certainly use a lot of code, a lot of comments in places where I'm just dealing with the reality that I don't want to take enough time to refactor the code the way that it should be so that it doesn't need the comments, or I didn't think through it enough. I didn't pay attention to the code smell and I didn't notice that. And I just left comments in that I could have potentially taken out, given more thought and more care. But then to go back to Jesse's point, or the point we're talking about with the training and the junior developers, or at least less experienced developers, as much as you're right, Jesse, there's better processes. For example, rather than a comment that tells somebody how to do it, like code reviews will allow you to make sure that a developer doesn't actually change something that shouldn't be, inappropriately, where a comment can warn against that, but a code review can say, oh, you're actually doing this thing and you don't want to do this thing. And I could have put in a comment, but I didn't. Now, on the other hand, the comment warns them of the problem before they have to get all the way down to the code review. So there's value there. But also, as much as it would be nice if every mid-level or more junior level developer got 100% pairing time with senior level developers, that's just not what a lot of companies find the situation they find themselves in. So the reality of your team, do you have a fair number of them? Is it a good idea to put in more comments to keep other people from affecting the code? And even team composition, the larger the team is, the more likely more people are going to touch code, gives more and more reason to look at comments. I think there's another thing that occurred to me about a replacement for comments, and that is commit messages, right? A lot of times you can use a commit message as a replacement for a comment. If you say refactor some code to be a lot more performant, you can put in a commit message that says, hey, I refactored this algorithm this way because it's a lot more performant. And if depending on the process, if somebody comes along, sees something weird, they're trained and primed to look at the commit history to see when and why that code was done a certain way, and then they see in the comment history of the commits, this is why it was done, then you could be a lot more expressive on something that doesn't potentially ever get lost, right? So that's also a potential replacement for comments. I'm not sure if that's actually a better replacement or not, but that is a potential replacement for comments is GitHub's. But I do think that being pragmatic about your team, about the realities of what you're dealing with, if you're going to be the only developer on a project, you probably need a lot fewer comments than as the team size scales up.
Yeah, and also to Preston's question, avoid cleverness. So what happens is if you have code that you have to go to the level of your team, right? And as a senior, you have to adapt, or as a more experienced developer. So you just write at the level of your team, and then you help your team level up. And as they level up, they will be refactoring that into something that they understand. But if you avoid cleverness, which is another code smell that's probably going to show up somewhere in the newsletter, when you write, you strive for simplicity and not cleverness, then I think a lot of the need for those comments go away. And when it comes to the comment that Joe was saying, I think when you find a place for a comment in the code, even if you're solo, even if you can do commits and all that, I think the idea behind it is the developer could have moved on. The code review is not enough for you to detect those things. There are things that you have to tell the code. You have to have on the code, and the code has to tell the next developer. You cannot depend on having the code review of someone that knows what's going on there, or the person that wrote it, because they have moved on, but the comment might stay explaining why we're doing that. So I still like having, in those cases that are really special, having it be part of the code. So when you open the code, you don't need no one to come in and pair with you in order to understand what's going on there.
I can chime in here too. I think just going back to the original question, some places where I tend to use comments, one in particular that no one's mentioned is if I'm having like constant or static values. So for example, like maybe I have like a UID in my code somewhere, or maybe like a URL or something, like, a port number that doesn't really have any real world significance. It just has significance in the code. I might say like, oh, this is why it's this, or this is where this value is coming from. I think that can be really useful. Another area too is if I'm catching very specific errors and I'm handling them in very specific ways, I think that's sometimes lends itself to a comment, just because it's a situation where you are reacting to something happening that's wrong, something going wrong in the code. And I found that sometimes those are areas that can be very confusing, explaining the why as opposed to just the how. And as far as the comment on junior devs, if you have junior devs in your team, should you be commenting more? I think my gut reaction to that was just feeling a little bit uncomfortable about it. I feel like you're kind of tailoring the code base to the developers at that stage in their career, as opposed to, maybe another team adopts that code base. Maybe, a more senior team comes in and then all of a sudden all these comments are just littered and, the senior devs don't need them. So I think in that sense, makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but I do get the point where, okay, sometimes having more comments to explain more things isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Until they get out of date. And I think that's going back to that base point is you go back and we make changes, we refactor. People don't look at the comments or they don't understand what the comments are actually documenting for sure. And they make their change and then they're no longer to date. And in ways that actually creates more problems because it creates confusion. And confusion then can lead to misunderstandings and then making decisions that are counter intuitive to what needs to be done. I think there's a balance maybe there. I think I still go back to the why that Luis was talking about. And I think also the other point that was made about the person that's doing the PR, just because you're doing a PR doesn't mean you actually know what the code does. To Joe's point about putting in comments on the commit, I never read those comments. That's the last thing I'll look at. Like who does that? Seriously, does anybody look at commit messages? Unless you're trying to, if I'm trying to find the commit that we're trying to roll out, right? Like, hey, this one's a problem. I'll go look at the commit messages. But otherwise, like maybe I could be trained. Like Pavlov's dog to hey, when there's a problem, I go look at the comments. But there's times what I'll do is I'll use the get feature of doing blame. I go like, yeah, Joe wrote that code. And then I might go have a conversation with you, Joe, and say, hey, why are you doing it this way? Help me understand.
I would say that I've sometimes in the past looked at commit messages to understand why code was crafted a certain way. If they actually looked to see if the commit message indicated something about confusing code. So maybe that's just a personal experience point that I've done that in the past, and that's not either one, very common, or two, it's not. And depending on what tools you're using, it may not be even extremely practical. A lot of tools like even Git could be hard to find commit messages, right? Depending on whether or not you have a UI or not, it could be painful to sort around and look at those sorts of things. Let's talk for a bit for the more junior developers, right? People that feel like they're a little bit more in the beginning side of programming, right? Maybe they found themselves using comments fairly heavily. Maybe they were taught to use comments all the time, right? By professors who have, undoubtedly all professors have significant amounts of real world experience. That's how college works, right? You can't teach until you've become a master, right? No, I don't want to bag on college professors. They're great. But so maybe you're taught to use heavy amounts of comments, whatever. You're deciding, you're listening to this and saying, well, wait a second, all comments are bad? Should I start? Like, what are things that we should talk to junior developers or, on the lower end or on the beginning end of their career? What advice would you give? Something more realistic and pragmatic to that end of the spectrum, rather than hey, for you 20-year developers, right? Every time you write a code comment, you're going to get your knuckles smacked by my ruler, right?
One thing I would say is, especially as a junior developer, a lot of the code that you're going to be writing is going to depend on the code base that you're working with. So I think really good tip is just take time and just look through the code in the code base, see how comments are being used. I mean, if you don't find any comments in 10,000 lines of code, it's probably not something that you should be doing. Whereas if you see people using comments, it's not a bad idea to just mirror the way that they're being used. I think that's just a good way to kind of figure out how you should be using them, is just how are the other developers using them.
Good advice.
That was better than mine. Because mine was limited of, developers in your team, right? If instead of you saying comments are bad or trying to explain the whole why thing, what I would probably do is, depending on what you're commenting, I think, was it you, Mike, talking about like magic strings or magic numbers in the code?
Yeah.
And you made a reference to that. Yeah. So you have things like, maybe you have a complicated if, some code inside of the if, the condition is a little complicated, and you feel the need to explain why this A means active plus this thing, this, that. So normally what I do is, when I find something like that, instead of explaining the whole concept, I say, okay, let's go and look at a pattern for refactoring this. And I would ask questions like, what does that mean to you? What does that condition means? And after you ask 4 or 5 times, eventually they come back to, oh, that means, a premium member that is not active. Okay, if that's what that means, we take that, I cut it from the if, and I write a small function, a one-liner function, and I name it that. So again, this might take a few iterations, like you ask him and ask them until you actually get the meaning, what that means. When you get that meaning, you say, is, such and such. And then return that condition and say, now we're going to write it in there. How does that read? Now, when you read, if is a premium member that hasn't been active for 2 months. Now it's pretty clear what the code is doing. And then I tell them, every time you see a piece of code where you need to add a comment explaining what it's doing there, see if you can refactor that to a one-liner function. And you get them into the habit of refactoring to better readable code, and they see the benefit right there. So, and this is the example of when you're using like magic strings, that's a good example for that too. It's like, I don't know what this A means. Right? So write a function that says is active and returns whether it's A or not. Something like that. So you find, and depending on the code that you're looking at, you have developed over the years different ways or different patterns on doing those refactorings. So take that as a teaching opportunity to say, every time you see this, we can use this technique to refactor it to this, and look at them and see the benefits. So that's normally what you do, but that requires that you have the person on your team that you could sit with them for a few minutes and go through that process with them, model it for them.
Yeah, I think for me, if I go into a code base and I'm new in that code base, I would much rather have a whole bunch of, even if the variable names are long or if there's a lot of one-line functions, but if I know exactly what they're doing, like Luis said, then I'm going to be able to be effective a lot more quickly than if I have to guess at what this big, long, complicated if statement conditional is or something like that. And so, I don't know if there's really any overhead in most languages now for creating a new variable or a new simple function like that or something, but I think at least most of the time you're probably okay to just split it out and write a new function, and it's going to help the other developers a lot more that come after you. And so good naming conventions and being very explicit in what the variable is, maybe try not to use X and Y or something like that, unless obviously it makes sense, but trying to name variables very clearly, that helps me a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the concept that I think of is what you've been describing is self-documenting code that I can read it and understand what's going on, and there's no magic numbers, magic variables, weird stuff. And then if I do that, I don't need comments. I think for a junior developer, what I would tell them is, hey, if you don't understand why something works, ask a question. And then the next phase is from that is go look at it, go look who wrote it, and then maybe try to understand why they wrote it that way. That's that next level of learning where I'm doing some investigation on my own. I'm trying to understand why this might be that way. Not trying to spend, the thing I would caution against is going down a rabbit hole and spending 2 days trying to understand why, but maybe spend, 5 minutes going like, okay, why would they do this? What's the meaning behind this? And then let's say it's Joe's code. And after kind of doing a little research, come ask Joe and say, hey, why this is this line of code? I was curious on why you did it this way. This is what I read about it. Help me understand. And in that way, when they do run across situations, because we're always, all of us are going to run across situations where we're looking at somebody else's code, and maybe it's not documented in a way that's 100% natural for us to understand, but then it's up to us to try to, get that understanding before we start making changes to it. And we can eliminate, we can eliminate often the need to document. The last thing I'll say is this, is that with the self-documenting code, I would ask the more junior developer to say, if you were another developer reading this code, would you have any questions? Do you feel like this adequately explains what's going on based on how you wrote it? And if not, what would you change?
About 10 months before we started Ruby Rogues, which is the oldest podcast on devchat.tv, I went freelance. And one of the things that I figured out pretty fast is that I had no idea what I was doing. And I made a bunch of mistakes, but I also made a bunch of friends who were doing freelance. And we got together and we started a podcast called The Freelancer Show. And The Freelancer Show has been running about as long as JavaScript Jabber. But we talk every week about all of the things that we were learning and doing in freelancing and giving people advice on how to get their business started so that they could go out and be independent if that's what they wanted. Nowadays, I'm not on the show anymore, but we have terrific people like Reuven Lerner and Eric Dietrich that come on every week and talk to you about how they run their businesses and give other perspectives on things that you can do. So whether it's how to find clients or whether it's how to step in and start doing training or other programs or how to run a business, they have a ton of experience. And they talk about all kinds of things that are going to help you pull things together and be successful as a freelancer. So whether you're thinking about moonlighting and trying it out, or whether you're going whole hog and quitting your job, you should definitely check out The Freelancer Show. And you can find that at freelancershow.com.
I'd like to pipe in one little small thing here and just say, if I was suggesting stuff to junior developers, I would say, don't feel afraid to, if you need to, put in extra comments or put in a fair amount of comments, even as much as I really like the advice of look at how much comments are made elsewhere in the code base, because putting in comments yourself insulates you from documenting what your intent was of your code. And then either later on when you have to look at it or somebody else has to come along and see this is what you meant, and then they can help you. But if you overuse comments, that might actually be acceptable as a transitionary period in your career as you get more and more used to doing things. And other people on your team can come along and help you with reducing the amount of comments that you take. But if going back to that trying to be too clever, it can be deceptive and easy to try to, I'll just, I heard the comments are bad. I'll not use them, and then end up doing something that a comment would help fix in the long run. So
I think that's a slippery slope, Joe.
But it is, you're right.
So just because it's been done a certain way in the past and it's not the right way doesn't mean that we should continue to perpetuate the pattern. And there's a point where we draw a line in the sand and say, stop. So to me, instead of looking at the code base and saying what's been done, the team should agree on a style. This is how we're going to do our code. This is our style guide. These are your guidelines for how we want you to write code. And so even if I have a code base that's chock full of comments that are inaccurate and it's just garbage everywhere, we don't want to just keep perpetuating that problem. Maybe we're trying to clean that up. And so again, I would challenge and say, instead of as a more junior developer, say, hey, put whatever comments you want in there, because again, it's just creating the problem. Because eventually those comments are going to get where they're no longer understandable. They no longer relate back to the code base. And so that problem is going to exist. So why not actually say, hey, instead of writing these comments, write your code in a way that it's self-documenting. What do you say to that?
I like it. I like it.
Like, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
That's true.
Exactly.
One thing that I frequently use as a piece of advice to people when learning new things, specifically about coding, is the only way to learn when not to use, the best way to learn when not to use something is to overuse it.
just keep your comments out of my code base, and that would be okay.
Exactly.
I mean, you comment your code in your own projects, Joe. That's fine.
Yeah. All right. So I want to finish up with another section on this. I just want to go through and look at some of the replies that I got to my email about code comments as a submit code smell. See if we could get some responses or some rebuttals. Some of the things people say. One, I just said, I just really disagree with you. All right. Here we go. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think the examples you've given are something to strive for, but having the luxury to write 100% perfect code all the time doesn't take into account real-world scenarios, such as inheriting an existing code base from another team, or simply adding good enough workarounds in order to hit a deadline that would otherwise be missed, or pushing a quick and dirty hotfix to stop the bleeding of some unforeseen issue. Best practices are important. Aiming to write code that is succinct and self-evident is a worthy goal, but going as far to say that comments are a code smell is not taking into account the messy reality of programming and the necessity of communication that's often lacking among engineers. There's almost a weird machismo about not commenting. It's like biking without a helmet. I love that analogy.
Seems reasonable.
Some people will be damned to even consider it, yet the cost is so little and the potential payoff so high, it's absurdly low effort, high impact that there is simply no reason not to do it. Comment your code and wear a helmet.
Only that in this case, the extra effort to go and buy and get the right helmet and always wear it is not the comments. It's the other way around. It's the effort that you invest in making your code readable. That's the helmet. That's how you protect yourself from the future, or from problems in the future. Now, the comments are like I'm going to jump into the bike and start going and figure it out along the way. That's the comments. That's the non-helmet in this example.
I think I do see what they're saying where, like, sometimes maybe we try to over-engineer up front and we have a deadline and we have to get stuff done. And so maybe we spend too much time trying to be too meticulous with our code and try to make everything perfect. Where if I don't know how many of you have said, like, I've done this where I've said, okay, I have like this idea for like this little side project I want to do just for kind of fun and see if I can do it. And I start going and I'm trying to make every single thing perfect. And then I just never finish the project because I got tired of it or it took too long or whatever. And so I think there are times where good enough is the best case scenario. And if you have a bug in production that's going and a code or a fix with a quick comment will take you 10 minutes, but finding out the true source of the problem and refactoring everything will take you 4 hours, then you have to go with the quick fix because it's in production. We have to get it out. And then maybe you come back and fix it so that you don't have that issue again in the future. But in that case, I think that a quick fix and a comment probably works, but you're going to run into that issue again if that's all you have. And so I still think making sure that you can refactor and then make your code readable so you don't have to have those comments is the ideal. But I can see where there could be times where, especially given time deadlines, you don't have the time to go through and really make the code as perfect as possible.
So that's a great point, Preston, but that's covered by the why. So like what we talked about earlier and saying, okay, look, I'm going to put a single comment in that says like, hey, this might be a to-do, or this wasn't perfect, but we were on a tight deadline and I did this because of this. There's a big difference between doing that and then documenting line by line, right? And really putting a lot of comments in that then no longer, that are explaining the how, going back to Louise's original explanation there. And also I get the fact that like good is good enough in most cases. And that code doesn't have to be perfect. And you bring up a great point, Preston, that how many times have we been in a project that we wanted it to be perfect and we just gave up on it, right? And especially if it's not a paying project that we're actually making money off of, we're being paid to do. But a lot of times we're getting projects that we're inheriting. And when we're inheriting those, we're usually either in one of two modes. We're either, hey, just business as usual, keep it going, or we are in, let's improve this and make this better. And if it's leave it alone, just do the whatever, then we're not committing to it. There's no budget that's been allocated to say, hey, look, let's improve this. So leave it as it is and just make the changes as you kind of go. But if we're improving the code, then I think it's an opportunity to say, hey, where can we refactor this? Where can we make it more readable? Every time you touch a component, it's your responsibility to update it, clean it up, make it better, those sorts of things. So there's my 2 cents.
Also, throwaway code and side project is probably one of those places where you're not as ready when it comes to code smells. Anyways, like you have that liberty. I think we care more about that when you have to work on a team and something that is in production. But definitely, comments are important when you're explaining the why. A quick fix or something that you had to take a shortcut for some reason, that's a why. You want to explain that. Otherwise, think of it as, is this what we would do if we had the time to do it the right way? No, let me explain why I'm doing it this way. And we go back to the why, for sure.
One thing I did like about that comment, though, is, as far as code smells go, I think comments is like probably one of the least deadly ones. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, the computer's not, the computer just ignores them. So, okay, maybe we have some stray comments, maybe there's one too many comments in the code base. But at the end of the day, like, you can just remove comments and the code's still going to work. Now, you could argue that comments get moved around, things could get confusing, but at the same time, it's not like it's, a horrible, horrible crutch for the code base.
That is exactly why they are so dangerous, because they hide a really insidious problem, which is your code is not expressive enough. And the way that we mask that is by adding, we don't want to take the time to think of a good naming. So you take the time to write comments all over the place. So they are so dangerous because it's like diabetes. If you have arthritis or something that is always bugging you, you always have that in your mind and you think about the stuff that you eat and you're always thinking about your meds. But you have diabetes like me, since there is no pain, no physical, nothing, that starts killing you because it's not right on your face all the time. So that's what happens with comments. They feel so.
That's a good point.
Yeah, they feel like they're harmless. No, they're not. They're revealing a really deeper problem.
Yeah, much earlier on, somebody, I can't remember, I think it was Jesse, said a point that I thought was really interesting, which was, I was looking at comments, and in my article, I talked about comments as they themselves, the existence of the comment is a code smell, but potentially another aspect of comments being a code smell is they are a flag that the code that they're commenting needs to be refactored, right? Regardless of looking at the code that they're commenting and saying, hey, this code has its own code smells, right? So the comment itself can be a code smell that points at, hey, there's probably code smells in the code that I'm commenting. Although I identify a lot with what Mike's saying, because as much as I talk about comments getting out of date, comments getting moved around and being in the wrong place, I also feel like in my career, 20 some odd years, I can't even think of a single time when a comment has actually led me astray because it got out of date. Now, granted, that may be because I tended to be on teams where we didn't use significant quantities of comments until there was a why. We didn't put in a lot of hows that quickly got out of date. But I also can't think of times when that really cost me, where other code smells, I can, name 5 and 10 and 100 times that a particular code smell, like duplication is an example, right? Or non-expressive code, like you were talking about, I think it was you, Luis, the idea of if you got an if statement and the if has this weird condition and just creating a function that describes what the condition is, like you're looking at that as a code smell, this if statement with a bunch of conditions in there and refactoring that to be an actual function that's named. That's the kind of code smell that bites you all the time. So as much as I put this out there as this ideal, I myself feel like I have been bitten by comments relatively small. But to Luis's point, if you then become in a habit of, let's just use comments to replace our desire to write expressive code. Hey, we don't have to write expressive code because we can put in comments instead. That gets this crutch, which lowers the quality level of your entire code base, right? And pushes you down as a developer because now you got this invisible crutch of comments. That makes it easy. I don't have to express it in my code because I can just write it in my comment what's going on, and I don't have to worry about does the code express the intent anymore.
Wait a minute. I have the answer. Yes. So when should you write comments and when comments are a code smell? The answer to that is it depends.
Nice.
Nice. Thank you for we all have that knowledge. Excellent.
All right, let's go through one more piece of feedback, and then I think we're getting close to. Is everybody okay to go a couple more minutes? This one came from somebody who actually felt like made some good points, right? So one of the things that they said, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with myself, but they actually wrote this was one of those emails that I got several people writing a page of text to explain to me why I was wrong. But this person says something I'd like to address specifically, one paragraph. Yes, comments have their downsides that you listed. They can get out of date. But it should be everybody's responsibility to keep the comments up to date or to update them when they realize they are out of date. And that update could be improving the code so that they are needed less or updating them because some requirements of the code change. And then he goes on and on. So I'd like to focus in on this one. Thoughts and responses.
I understand what this person is saying, but I feel like it's just adding more to what we already have to do. And if I'm told, hey, you need to go there's a bug in this section of the code and I have to fix it. And then I have to also remember to update the comments or even sometimes removing them. Sometimes I'll just kind of get tunnel vision on fixing this one problem and I'll forget to change the comments. And so And I found the same thing with like actual documentation where it's a README or something that's their real documentation that on the one hand, it can be, really beneficial, but a lot of times I just forget to do that because I have so many things to do that writing documentation or cleaning up documentation, a lot of times that just falls, way down on the priority list. And so while, everybody could update it as they go along by either removing the comments or updating them, I think it's probably more likely that they just get ignored, except by maybe the person that put them there in the first place. Maybe sometimes you come back and you see them and you read them, but it's probably more likely to just get ignored because we have a lot of things to do, lots of bugs to fix, and lots of deadlines.
I think that the writer that has some good points, and that is if you agree as a team that you're going to write this type of code and that's how you want to do your project, there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to understand what the trade-offs are. Here's what you're potentially trading off for. Here's where you may sacrifice quality, and you're going to now have to write more stuff, those comments to document this out, which then could result in maybe less than desirable code. And that's fine. And you can have that agreement, but you do need to understand the trade-off that you're making, and that there might be a better way. That you might actually look at if we wrote our code that was better thought out, more self-documenting, we wouldn't need the comments. It would be easier for us to maintain. But that's for everybody to learn, and decide on their own, like what's right for them in their project. I wouldn't want to tell. It's just like I've seen a lot of discussions where people go, no, this is the right way. No, that's the right way. No, I get it. There's lots of different ways to do the same exact thing and achieve a positive result. But we need to understand what the trade-offs are for those decisions and then be able to live with those decisions going forward.
One thing that does make me a little uncomfortable, this idea of updating comments. I actually do agree with the commenter that, if you are going to have comments, that then you should be updating them. But I think like if you have a line of code and there's a comment above it, you might be less inclined to refactor that code because there's already the comment there. So you're like, oh, I'll just update the comment, make the change. You almost feel like you got to keep the comment in there because it's just part of it. So I think, it all just depends. And if that's how you're going to do it in your team, that's how you're going to do it. But I would always err on the side of, if we can get rid of this comment, let's get rid of it, as opposed to like, oh, we just need to update the comment, just a different mentality.
All right. Any final thoughts on this?
Yes. My favorite comments in code.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually reminded about a little segment that was added to a product that's been in production for many, many years. It's all of us have probably used it at one time or another. There's like this one really big, nasty spaghetti mess of logic. We found this comment that was left in the code. And it was this comment, it basically was drawn out, ASCII art of this kitten. And it says, every time these calculations are run, God kills a kitten. So it was horrible in that light, but it was funny. It was comical. We're like, oh my God, yeah, this needs to be refactored. This is bad. So favorite comment of all time.
That's awesome.
And I'm not condoning killing cats, by the way. Sorry.
I had one more thought too from earlier, where if you come into a new project, especially as a younger developer, if you see something that looks confusing, it may be just something that you haven't really learned how to do very well. And so before thinking, I'm going to add a comment here because this is kind of confusing, like be willing to go and learn what that thing is. You may have to ask a question, but I was just thinking about like RxJS. I write a lot of Angular and I have lots of operators that I'm throwing into pipes and mapping the data through all this so that it comes out from the API how I want it. And I can totally see where a new developer, especially helping train a new developer on our team right now, and I can totally see where they look at that and say, I've got no idea what's going on here. That doesn't mean that I should add comments to my code necessarily, but help them to learn, help these junior developers, or ask a question if you are a junior developer for an explanation of what's going on so that you can read it and you don't need those comments. Because sometimes stuff, it might look like you're trying to be clever. You're not. You're just using, new features of JavaScript or using a library or something like that. So don't be afraid to ask questions because it can get cleared up and usually a lot better than a comment could do anyways.
Awesome.
A couple of years ago, I put out a survey asking people what topics they wanted us to cover on devchat.tv, and I got 2 overwhelming responses. One was from the JavaScript community. They wanted a React show. And the other one was from the Ruby community, and they wanted an Elixir show. So we started both. The React show, though, is React Roundup. And every week, we bring in people from the React community, and we have conversations with them about React, about the community, about open source, about what goes into React, how to build React apps, and what's going on and changing in the React community. So if you're looking to keep current on the current React ecosystem and what's going on in React, you definitely need to be checking out React Roundup. You can find it at reactroundup.com.
All right. I think with that, we'll wrap up. That was a fun conversation to have, and move on to our final round of something you'd tell a friend about. So who wants to go first?
Talked about Git, source tree.
Huh?
Live a happy life. Go to source tree from Atlassian. Like the people from Bitbucket, they have this product. It's a free product, source tree. It works really nice. And if you need to go searching for comments, Jesse, you just, they're easier to find and read there. Even the extra information about a comment. So source tree, sourcetreeapp.com, I think.
I've mentioned this on the show before, but Google Fi, they just came out with this unlimited plan. It's like unlimited data. So I just switched over to that. It's pretty great. So definitely recommend it.
Awesome. Preston, what about you?
So I'm going to recommend a podcast again. This one is called Office Ladies, and it's for anyone who's a fan of the TV show The Office, where the actresses who played Pam and Angela, each week they're going to watch an episode and then break it down and give behind the scenes stuff and information on it. So I think that so far they just have like a little 4-minute clip out that's like an intro. I can't remember when they start. I think it's either this week or next week when the first episode drops. The little 4-minute intro was really funny. And so I'm going to be listening to that. So I think it'll be great for anyone who's a fan of The Office.
Very cool.
Awesome.
I'll go next. So I'm going to talk about something that I did over the weekend that was unbelievably fun. So I went for a test drive in a Tesla Model X. And I got to tell you, it was absolutely incredible. Great vehicle. Felt like a sports car, 4.4 seconds from 0 to 60. And that's the slow version. They have the performance one that does it in 2.7, but I would not have a license more than about 30 days with a car like that. So, but really enjoyed it. Love the technology in the car. Did a lot of the driver assist stuff and getting to play around with that and seeing how far we've come with sensors and sonar, radar, whatnot. And so if you haven't driven one, I'd highly recommend you go check out, any one of their models and play around with it. Definitely a cool experience.
That's awesome. All right. I'm pretty sure I'm going to pick the geekiest thing here. By far the nerdiest thing that's been mentioned so far. I recently got exposed to, I could barely call it a board game. I was showing pictures to the other people on the panel before we started the podcast episode called Gaslands. Essentially, it's like an actual slow board game, not a fast-moving, a typical, board game. You move pieces around. But imagine it's Mad Max Fury Road as a board game, except the pieces are Matchbox and Hot Wheels cars that you yourself just buy, and you can customize them however you want. And then you play the board game where your little cars fight against the other player's cars in a death race to shoot each other up. And you just have to buy the book. And then other than that, you just buy the cars. And there's this whole, you can find YouTube channels on people that take Matchbox cars and customize them and make them look like cars from all the Mad Max movies or the Death Race movies or all that. And they customize them to look all crazy and then play it with other players in a race. And, you can play, I think you can play with just 2 people, but super fun, very cheap to do because, Matchbox cars are $1 and the book was like $20. So I just got exposed to this. I haven't even played yet, but I was super excited this weekend. I went and took a Matchbox car and made it all bloody and oily and glued Lego pieces to it to make guns on it and had a ton of fun. So it's Gaslands is the name of the game. Gaslands.
You're right. That is the nerdiest.
Is that not the overly nerdiest thing you've ever heard?
Cool, though. That's pretty cool.
Did you see the picture of the car before?
I did. Yeah, because my sound wasn't working. I could see a picture of a car. I'm like, what's Joe doing? This is going to be a really interesting podcast today, apparently.
Yep.
So Jesse, when can I go drive your Tesla?
As soon as you come to Denver, I'll let you do a test drive with me. That's how actually I got turned on to it. I was out in Las Vegas, and Chris Savalejo was like, "Hey, you want to drive my Tesla?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And we go to get on the highway, and he's like, "Punch it." And I punched, and all of a sudden I was like, "Oh my gosh, like this is unbelievable." A lot of fun. So it's actually got me interested in doing solar with a power wall and my own charger at home. And yeah, so really, really cool. So come on over.
All right. Hopping on a plane.
All right. Excellent.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you all next time.
Excellent. Thank you.
Adios.
Thanks. See ya.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.